for joining us. We have 27 attendees who are already in the virtual space. We are seeing where persons are just taking some time getting themselves logged in. So we hope that person will do that shortly. My name is Dr. Lloyd Parks, and I will be basically your host, your facilitator for this webinar. Our topic, as you can see, is addressing common pitfalls in employment relations in the Caribbean context. And it's very interesting. Between the time we initially advertised this webinar and now so many interesting things have come on the scene in this area of employment relations in our context in the Caribbean and even globally with COVID-19. And we are going to be talking about some of those things and then some as we go through this webinar. And so my name is Dr. Lloyd Parks. I am the Leadership Development and Institutional Strengthening Specialist to the Caribbean Center for Development Administration. Also with me is our virtual producer, Trudy Waterman, and of course, our featured guest presenter, who I will introduce to you a little later on. But as we get started, we want to ensure that you have the best possible experience in terms of being able to hear, audio quality, etc. And so we like to remind our webinar participants about some basic rules. So first, we want to close all software applications, except WebEx, of course. And you want to mute your phones, your cell phone, your office phone, because we don't want anything to be disturbing you or distracting you. You will notice that once you enter the virtual space, you are muted. And so that is really to just ensure that we can all hear each other and that there is no feedback sound. But as we go along, should you wish to speak, I will tell you how you can do that, and we will unmute you. Remind your colleagues that you're unavailable. This is a short but hopefully impactful learning intervention. Just a little over an hour. So we wanted to just focus and get the most out of it. If you have an internet cable that's available, then it's good to plug that in. It keeps your internet Wi-Fi quality a little stronger. Well, not your Wi-Fi, but you know, if you're not, in case you find it hard to rely just on the Wi-Fi, then the internet cable will help out your connection, the strength of your connection. And if you do have a good working headset and microphone, we encourage you to use that as well. So some other little tips so that you can participate as fully as possible in this webinar. We want to bring your attention to the toolbar that is to the right of your screen below the list of names. And the first one starting from the left is the raise hand feature. So at the appropriate time, we might encourage you, we will be encouraging you to ask questions, and one of the ways that you can do that is to raise your hand. So you will simply click on that icon, and don't worry, we are able to tell the order in which persons have raised their hands, and we will get to you. The other feature we want to point you to is right beside the raise hand feature, and that is the green check mark, and that means a yes. So if the sun is shining where you are today, do give me a green check mark. Let me see that you have seen where the green check mark is. Thank you, Charla. I see you have found the green check mark. Quite a few people have found the green check mark. Alicia, Christiane, Latoya, Maria, Rosamond, quite a few, Ajodia. Great. Thank you all. And so to get rid of the green check mark, you simply click on the green check mark again and it will go away. And the other one I want to point you to is the X, the red X. And so we just want you to click on the X for us. Let us know that you're seeing the X. Yes, Rosamond, I see you have found the X. Similarly with Christiane, Kelisha, Latoya, quite a few others. Hadley, Jean-Marc, Jean, Ajodia, Allison, great. And so again, we invite you to just take down the X by just clicking on the X once again. Great. The other thing I want to point you to, well, let me go back here because I forgot one thing right back there, the chat feature, which I know a lot of you know it, you're acquainted with it already. So just below the list of names on the right hand, there is a chat feature. So you will see send to, and we want you to make sure that you click all participants. So if you have a question or comment as we go along, we're going to invite you to type in the chat feature. So if you have found it, just say a simple good morning to everybody in the virtual space. I'm just going to type good morning, and you will see it. So if you have found the chat feature, just click and just type it. I see Jonas found it, Charlotte, great. And so I know many of you, this is your preference for sharing your comments and your questions, and we'll be checking the chat feature to take your comments and questions as we go along. Great. So one more thing I want to show you, and that's a pointer tool. So there's another toolbar just above the slide, and you will see, starting at the left, a right-facing arrow. That is your pointer tool. So if you put your cursor on the pointer tool, it becomes a right-facing arrow, and then you can drag the arrow to wherever you wish, and then once you click, it lands there. So you will see my pointer pointing at annotated tools. I see Christiana's found it, her pointer, and she's at type text. Jodia, Alison, so many persons have found their pointer tool. Awesome. So when you get another opportunity to use your pointer tool, so I'm going to encourage you, just point to the arrow, point your arrow where you're joining from today. Which country are you joining us from today? So I am joining from Jamaica. I see quite a few folks are joining from all over the Caribbean, from Antigua, from Barbados, from Trinidad. And if by any chance your country's flag isn't there, by all means, do type it in the chat. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. This is truly a regional affair. And I talked earlier about this pandemic that has come down on all of us here in the world. And I thought, one of the things we are always preaching here at CARICAD and through our leadership development programs is leadership resilience. And one of the tools for leadership resilience, of course, is laughter. Laughter helps us to ease our tension. And I know many of us are experiencing a lot of anxiety around this COVID-19. And so, can I tell you, I'm rather looking like this morning. So definitely no video. A little more laughter. So many of us are called upon to work remotely suddenly. And some of us are marrying that with childcare responsibilities and homeschooling. So I remember teasing my colleague Trudy to say this is what she has to do to her children to work from home. A little more humor here. Well, in the Caribbean, certainly in Jamaica, there is a saying that says, when trouble take you, fitness should fit you. And so it really talks about necessity being the mother of invention. So we are being very inventive in these times of crisis. And of course, we recognize that life will never be the same after this pandemic. There's so many things that are going to be forever altered. So this is just another humor around that. But guess what? After it's all, we are going to survive. And we'll be able to tell our grandchildren, I survived the great toilet paper crisis of 2020. But getting to a little more serious matters, the matter at hand. I want you to place in the chat before we start officially at 9, what are some of the pitfalls that you have experienced or maybe you are experiencing right now in the area of employment relations? Because our webinar this morning is by and large a question and answer discussion format. And so we definitely want to hear from you. So we're going to invite you. Use the chat. You can raise your hand as well. And let us get those questions in. And we are hoping that we can respond to all of them. So what are some of the pitfalls that you have experienced or are currently experiencing? Again, you can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat. So we'll look out for those questions at this time. So thank you, Hadley. Hadley is the first out of the block. And Hadley is saying practitioners and employees are not always clear on the application of newer legislation. And so, Hadley, I wonder if you could type in what, give an example of some of this newer legislation that you are making reference to. That will help us to better respond to your question or to your issue. Thank you. Remember, you can type your questions in the chat. You can also just raise your hand and we'll take note of those questions that you have. Just checking. Don't be shy. Alrighty then. We will continue, and as we go along, we're invited to continue to think of those questions that you have, keep them coming, type them in the chat. You can raise your hand, but I'm going to just go to the official welcome for this webinar. We at the Caribbean Center for Development Administration, at least once a month, sometimes twice a month, we do post these publicly, freely available webinars to help all of us as leaders, particularly in the Caribbean region, to continue our ongoing learning and development and networking, all with the aim of helping us to be better equipped to build our capacity to lead in this environment that we call our wonderful Caribbean. And certainly for today, this topic is something that has come up time and time again across our Caribbean region, where we see there are challenges in how we administer, navigate the employment relations landscape. So just to put this in context, our work here at CARICAD is very much driven by the Caribbean Public Service Charter and the conceptual framework around it. And so this conceptual framework is aimed at ensuring that we have responsiveness, results, resilience, and sustainability in our economies. And of course, that has to be on the basis of having a citizen-oriented public service. And of course, this conceptual framework consists of 6 pillars: standards, governance, accountability, openness, legislation, and of course, capacity. And our webinar here today is sort of a cross-cutting one in terms of how it relates to our conceptual framework. So employment relations clearly affects capacity, or capacity to have a workforce that is motivated, engaged, and high performing. But it also touches on, our legal framework around employment, and to some extent, our governance structures around employment relations issues. And so this diagram, it just shows the various subsets and sub-themes under the 6 pillars. And if you want to learn more about our charter, please do visit our website at www.caricad.net. And so today, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Carla-Ann Harris-Roper. She is our facilitator for our webinar this morning. She is an attorney at law, she is a published author, and she is currently principal consultant with Employment Matters Caribbean. And Carla-Ann has a tremendous passion for employment law and labor relations. And she has had a broad and varied career as a labor and employment relations practitioner, not only in the corporate world, but also in the public sector. And she's also somebody who has done very serious research in this area of employment law and employment relations. So she is eminently qualified to facilitate this session with us this morning. And so it is my pleasure to now hand over the reins to Carla-Ann. So Carla-Ann, thank you so much.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you loud and clear, Carla.
Okay.
You can proceed with the slides by clicking forward.
Okay, so it's my show now.
Yes, indeed.
All right, everyone. It's really quite a great opportunity for me to be able to share and to also learn from you, because I'm sure there are many things that you would have met upon in your, various professional duties and otherwise that I may not yet know. And so this is the beauty of a seminar like this, that we can share and, learn together. So when Lloyd asked me to, sit so we could have a discussion on this, we were just starting to hear about coronavirus. We had heard that something was happening in China, and we were watching it. Some of us were, some of us weren't. But then it has taken on a life of its own. So what is this coronavirus, or specifically COVID-19? There are many types of coronaviruses, I have come to learn, and some of them can cause things like the common cold and other respiratory illnesses. But there are, however, other coronaviruses that can cause more serious diseases, and those include SARS, which is something we heard of, a couple of years ago, and the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or called MERS. So COVID-19 is a genre, if you will, of the coronavirus. It is a disease which is caused by a newly identified type of the coronavirus, which emanated or emerged out of China December last year. Now, I'm not going to be like a particular president and call it the Chinese virus. I think that's discriminatory. But the fact is, it appears that it did, come out of China and has caused this recent outbreak. One of the things that has really come home to me, though, through all of this, and perhaps you guys can tell me if it's the same for you, is the whole impact of globalization. Once upon a time, when something happened, you'd hear it in the news or on the wires, and if it was happening in Africa, it was in Africa and it didn't affect you. But with, the whole concept of globalization and trade and open borders, we are now seeing that, we can't just ignore what's happening in other parts of the world and just think of it as a new story. So the signs and symptoms of COVID-19, according to the WHO, common signs are respiratory symptoms, fever, cough, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, and in more severe cases, the infection can cause pneumonia, severe acute respiratory syndrome, kidney failure, and as we have been seeing in some of our Caribbean countries, and certainly, on the international news across Europe, US, and China, South Korea, even death. So how do we treat this COVID-19? Well, unfortunately, currently there is no vaccine that has yet been developed. There's a race to try and find, something. We've heard that our neighbors over in Cuba, they have some regime that helps to diminish some of the symptoms, but it is, however, not a particular specific vaccine for coronavirus. But however, there are standard recommendations as to how to prevent the infection. So we are encouraged to regularly wash our hands, cover our mouths and nose when coughing. We are recommended to do that in the crook of our elbows or in a tissue, and immediately dispose of it and wash our hands. Avoid close contact with anyone who's showing symptoms such as coughing or sneezing, and of course to stay out of the zone that would allow us to, or get us predisposed to this virus. So hence the new word, social distancing and all of that. So as of yesterday, when I made some checks, and I am subject to hearing from colleagues who are on the line, of the land related to COVID-19 across the Caribbean. Did some checks with some of my colleagues all across, and to date, it appears that St. Kitts and Nevis is the country. Oh, wow. Thank you, Joan. I'm seeing that you have confirmed 2 new cases yesterday, because up to Sunday when I made a check, it was still the 1. So thank you for that information. So St. Kitts and Nevis had 0. Up to yesterday, I thought Belize didn't have any, but 1 was confirmed. Trinidad and Tobago now has 51 cases. Interesting stuff happening with Trinidad and Tobago nationals, but we'll chat about that later. So we'll see the lay of the land. And for those, yes, the numbers keep changing daily. As we see from the various news conferences that are being held across our countries, we're recognizing that we are taking all kinds of steps to reduce the possibility of transmission of the virus. But I suspect we are going to have to walk through this, hopefully, with more or less severity. So what's the impact of COVID-19 on employment? Because of the ease with which this virus can be transmitted, and also importantly, what we are learning is that it is possible that persons can spread the virus without showing any symptoms. So, you'd be looking to see if you're coughing, if you're sneezing, if you have a temperature, that those symptomatic persons are the ones who would be able to spread the virus. But what it does appear now is that you can have asymptomatic persons not showing any signs, but they are still carrying the virus. So it will impact all spheres of life, and most times negatively with various levels of impact. So thus the virus at its worst stage can make someone extremely sick, and of course that would impact their ability to work and in turn trigger a number of possible actions on the part of the employer on the one, the employee on the other. That's what I think, given the season in which we are at, we could have a productive discussion about these issues today. So when Loy asked me to talk, she said, it's more likely than not that we'll have a sort of question and answer. So I've only seen one question so far. So I'm throwing the floor open to questions on it is that the team would like me to share some thoughts that I may have on labor and employment related matters in respect of COVID. So Loy, you could guide me here.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, there's something that Ajodia from Trinidad raised in the chat. And here we find that we're in a situation where for many of our Caribbean countries, our current legal structure, our current policies don't speak to our current situation.
Correct.
So how then should employers deal with this issue? You don't have, you can't just say, oh, the policy says this, the staff order says that, the law says that. So how then do you proceed?
Well, that guys, goes to the heart of what employment and labor relations is. I say to many people in spheres of endeavor that I get, co-opted in, is that the law is a reluctant entrant into employment relations. The law is used, and if you look at it quite a bit of the time, the law is putting in minimum standards and saying this is a floor of rights of employment, lawyers call it, to put in place to say you can't go below that minimum standard in treating with employees or other related employment stakeholders. But it therefore gives the employer and the employee, and in some cases unions, the opportunity to find creative ways to address concerns. So to specifically answer that question, this is an unprecedented event, and truly it's not something that, for the most part, our legislators may have contemplated. And it's not just a Caribbean thing. We are not quote-unquote third world. First world countries are grappling with the same thing. And so, whilst it is that in some of those countries they are a bit quick off the ball, they go to the parliament and enact legislation, have their stakeholder meetings and come up with some kinds of legal structures to deal with it. It does come down a lot of the time to making sure that those minimum standards are kept, and then you work through to find ways within which you can operate to the best in light of the given circumstances. So, for example, in Jamaica, there in 2014 was a legislation that was passed called the Employment Flexible Work Arrangement Miscellaneous Provisions Act. And what that law was doing was taking away the legal strictures to employers operating a flexible work arrangement, so that persons didn't have to go all the way down into the office to make sure that they can sign their name in the register and sit at a particular chair to do their roles. Given that, we had robust IT capacity and being able to produce some of the work accountabilities via a remote mechanism. So you'll find that persons who took up that opportunity to structure their businesses in a way that you could work virtually, they were ahead of the curve when COVID landed, so that they could continue to produce and do all the accountabilities of their job seamlessly. And those persons who did not fully or even at all examine whether or not any aspect of their business could be done in a flexible way now find themselves scrambling to try and find out how to operate in this new paradigm. So it's a bit of a work in progress. It's going to take creative leadership, thinking outside the box from an employer, and to ensure that the minimum standards that the laws currently provide are not they are not breached, whilst at the same time seeking as best as possible to keep your business going and keeping in mind the ever-present threat of COVID-19 and what it could do to the whole country, your particular country, if the protocols for dealing with the disease is not dealt with properly.
Thank you so much, Carla. There are two other questions. One is from Joan. She has typed in the chat. Are you able to say how many Caribbean countries have unemployment benefits? And this has certainly been an issue, really, because we anticipate, and it has started, the fallout in terms of persons losing their jobs. And so what are the mechanisms in place in terms of a social safety net for those persons? So let's take that question.
Right. So currently, as far as I'm aware, there are 2 countries that have specifically legislated what is called unemployment insurance or unemployment benefits. So the Bahamas, in their National Insurance Act, Section 21H, and Barbados, also under their national insurance framework, have put in place particular structures that persons who lose their job can get a minimum benefit. I'm not remembering the exact number of weeks right now for each jurisdiction. They are able to access a particular sum based on where they work and the circumstances under which they lost their job in legislation. However, I've been keeping my ear to the ground, and with what this COVID outbreak is likely to do, some of our Caribbean governments have recognized the impact. One of them comes readily to mind is that we rely a lot on tourism. From many of our countries, tourism is our biggest contributor to GDP. And of course, with the travel ban, nobody is going to come. So we have empty hotel rooms, and as a consequence of our employees not having work. And it's in the Caribbean, well, in Jamaica we call it common sense, but across the Caribbean I've heard similar terms used. That if it is that you're not earning the capacity to pay, notwithstanding that an employee is ready and willing to work, just doesn't exist. So in Grenada, for example, reached out to the labor commissioner there, and he confirmed what I thought I heard Dr. Keith Mitchell say, that they were going to put in place a structure to give persons who would have lost their jobs, they have created a pool of funds that they could go into the NIS office and make an application to say, listen, I have lost my job as a result of this, and I am seeking redress or some assistance. What I do understand is that this is not a matter that has not been dealt with by Grenada before. And I think that is something that our governments may need to actively look at. My concern was, yes, there is pool of funds, but it could be a logistical nightmare for a technocrat to say how it is that persons would become eligible for this payment. But I was advised that, they had a precedent with what happened with Hurricane Ivan back in 2004. The structure, how it is that persons could apply for and receive a minimum, tied over benefit. And so I see someone else saying that the Trinidad and Tobago government also advised of some social benefits in terms of, trying to tide over persons. I did hear Dr. Keith Rowley in his press statement, along with, I believe, there was another cabinet minister saying that in some particular instances, if persons have lost their job and can't pay their rent, for example, they could get a rental subsidy and other social assistance mechanisms that currently exist would be topped up to help. So whilst it is that there is no real structure outside of those countries that I'm aware of, Bahamas and Barbados, governments are seeking to put in place, as far as I can see, some sort of mechanism to cushion the job losses in those circumstances.
Thanks, Carla. To add to that, I do know that in Jamaica, they have put in place, or they're attempting to put in place, something somewhat similar to what you described is happening in Grenada, where you'll have some form of cash transfer system to provide assistance to persons who would have lost their jobs as a result of the fallout from COVID-19 as well. Another area that has come up, there is a question in the chat, but I know persons who once, they were registering and they started to send in questions even before the webinar. And so there is a common question about the use of vacation leave. Yeah. So for a lot of organizations, both public and private sector around the region, with the fall off in economic activity, one of the options that some of the organizations are trying to use is to say, okay, go on leave, take your vacation leave. And so I wanted to speak to that. And, in the countries where that might actually be legal, places where, in fact, that you can't force people to take vacation leave, how do you treat with that issue?
Okay, you're absolutely right about that, Loy. Guys on the phone. Each Caribbean country, we are sovereign nations, and whilst we have a shared background, there are various provisions in specific legislation across each of these countries that would guide how persons can access their vacation leave, and that has been buttressed by case law, where persons have challenged how vacation leave is dealt with. Another dichotomy that we have to look at when we are looking at that is that vacation leave entitlement in the public service varies somewhat considerably with vacation leave in the private sector. So, for example, in Barbados, based on their holidays with Pay Act, the understanding is that the employees are to be encouraged to take their annual holidays. But if they don't, the employers have a right under the law to determine when the employee should go on holiday once they give 14 days notice. Conceptually, in that case, in Barbados, the employer could, having given 2 weeks notice to the employee, say, we're requiring you to go on your vacation. However, in Jamaica, the case law is basically the opposite, in that the vacation leave is said to be a benefit to the employee. And as such, it can't be used or unilaterally force the employee to take the vacation. They're really encouraging that there be a mutual agreement as to when is the best time for the employee to go off. But in the absence of that, the employer cannot force the employee to take vacation leave or to use vacation leave in a as a disciplinary measure. So, for example, there is some allegation against an employee, and you want to either do an investigation or to say get them out of the place quickly. You can't send somebody on vacation that in that sense because it's not being used for the intended purpose under the legislation. Now, in the public service, vacation leave tends to be a little bit different because of the nature of public service and the legal structures that underpin public service, given the various public service regulations and the constitutions and so on. So, for example, in Jamaica, the employee may be able to consolidate or accumulate rather their vacation leave up to a particular number of days. But if they go past that, in those circumstances only, could a head of department or permanent secretary mandate that this person go off, to basically pull down that accumulated leave. But outside of that, you can't force an employee in Jamaica to go on vacation, notwithstanding these, unprecedented events. I looked at the Holidays with Pay Act in Guyana, and in Guyana there is provision that you really should take that leave within 3 months of it being in your entitlement to it. And thereafter, if you don't do it that way, then mutual agreement. So I'm saying all of that to say it would be a good thing in these circumstances if employees would be reasonable to say, given the unprecedented nature of this, let me access my vacation. So the employer who would have budgeted for that could use that to tide you over for whatever the period that you have and pay it whilst we. But it all depends on the particular industry you are in and the legislative framework. And so in those cases, a little bit more research would have to be done to see if it is that you can push the employee into it, or the better approach in my mind would be to find a mutual agreement to use that as a manner to, reduce the outlay for an employer. Interestingly, in Dr. Mitchell's public broadcast on Sunday, one of his 17 or 18 points that he said the government would be using to combat this would be to ask the union movement in Grenada to work along with employers to use vacation leave as the first port of call, to allow them to deal with the fact of any employee not being able to be out at work. So from a government perspective, in Grenada, they were seeking to have, this sort of engagement and agreement to utilize that. So, it's fluid, and a lot will depend on your particular country. And, after this, I could do some more research on it.
Thanks, Carla. There are quite a few questions in the chat. We're going to go through them as quickly as we can. So, A. David says, should employees who are asked to stay home be allowed to claim those allowances that are work-related, such as a lunch subsidy?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Most of these allowances, so for example, travel, lunch, those sorts of allowances would in the normal scheme of things, to my mind, are all contractual. They are not legislated to say somebody should get a lunch allowance um, or a traveling allowance, except specific countries have those provisions, which I haven't come across. Be that as it may, my own view is that I would look to see what the contract says, or if there is a union, what your collective agreement says. Generally speaking, those sort of allowances are the type you may have like an upkeep for your vehicle that is a part of the benefit, which is separate from a traveling allowance, which is you get that traveling allowance if you travel on company business. So you'd have to examine the nature of the allowance, the agreement you have with your employee or their collective body union, staff association, to see how those would operate in a circumstance when persons are not at physical work. But as I say, for almost every one of these things, reasonableness and practicality should always be at the center of it. That if it is that the parties, given what is going on, can take creative approaches to ensure that at the end of this storm, there is a job to go back to. So if there can be discussions around suspending some of those allowances during that period, that should also be encouraged. But generally, it's like if you go on vacation or off on study leave in some instances and you are not there, we have some of these type of allowances that would normally accrue for what you are actually doing, that those wouldn't be paid in periods that you are not actually at work.
Thanks for that. Here's another question. It's saying, recognizing that employers do have an obligation to provide a safe environment for staff. So, what recourse does an employer have if some employees are not compliant with the safety measures promoted by the local and international public health officials?
A very, very good question. The fact remains that the employer at common law have 4 core duties to the employee, and that's separate and apart from any duty that is placed on them by, say, an occupational safety and health structure, or if it's a specific industry where they may have higher safety standards like mining or quarrying or areas like that. So those 4 common law standards to provide a safe system of working, safe place of work, competent staff and fellow workers, and good supervision. If it is that you have persons who insist on not following those provisions and then expose the employer to liability either for themselves or for other employees, the employer, I believe, would be in his right to document what is happening and bar such an employee from, being in a space that would expose them to liability. A lot of the times, some of us are not appreciative of what the issues are because they don't get the communications. We know that we have various levels of employees that maybe some of them don't appreciate the impact or the import of why you're asking them to do something. And so we have to ramp up the communication as well. And another big factor that I've been seeing in my practice since this has started is that you do have some persons that are literally almost living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck. And their view is, and for the most part it is true, that if they do not work, then they will not get paid. And without pay, they don't have any way to sustain themselves or their families. So some persons are seeking to present themselves to work so that they can get paid. And there is where I believe I see somebody in the chat, I just quickly glanced over there talking about what's the employer's moral obligation in these sort of circumstances. Of course, morality is not legislated, but in these sort of circumstances, it's a slippery slope, and a lot of employers find themselves between a rock and a hard place. They really want to do right by their employees, but their pockets are not deep. They really can't afford to pay all salary without income generating, which is stopped because of the social distances and closing down. And so they don't have the capacity to pay either all or some. In some instances, persons can pay a percentage, and they're encouraged to do that. So I find that another thing that will help is trying to communicate as best as possible to some of these errant employees the why, so they can appreciate what is happening, and hopefully that will help them to make the correct decision in staying away from work, or practicing good hygiene, or doing the social distancing bit.
Great. Thanks. Another question from Tashion. She's asking, one question I don't think we can answer, Tashion, what you're asking, is it likely that government will be cutting staff in order to cushion the economic blow? So, we're not the government, so we really can't say or speak to that. But the other part of your question is, are there laws that would protect the employee in the public sector context? So, Carla, can you speak to that?
This, again, a lot would depend on the specific jurisdiction from which a question emanates. So this would be just a general response, subject, of course, to what the specific country's provisions are, and not to be discounted what government policy is implemented during this period. So generally speaking, as far as I am aware, there's no legal provision in the public service that speaks to this sort of specific situation. However, based on the uniqueness of it, I believe any government is going to try its best to cushion the blow for the public service, which generally across all jurisdictions is the country's largest employer. To have persons out and not be able to provide essential services, or not even essential services, those people are more likely to be protected. But just services when this is passed is going to be a difficulty. And I'm taking the public service not just to say you're working in a government department or ministry, but take, for example, your teachers who are being asked to stay home. Once it is that this passes, we expect that teachers would be required to, revert to the classroom. So I don't know of any specific legislative protective provision, but I believe most governments would try to hold employment open during the period, and thereafter, work through the issues that may arise.
Thanks for that response. Next question that's in the chat. What framework or approach or set of steps would you recommend for employers to take to ensure that while they address the needs of employees, that they also stay within the ambit of the law and HR requirements?
Beautiful question. The first thing would be to assess what the legal provisions are and what your company policies provide for. So when you make that assessment, you know what your minimum standards are that you cannot go below, which is the floor of rights as provided by legislation and government policy. And then you look to see what your company or establishment has in place to deal with issues of this nature. So, for example, if you have provision for sick leave if somebody is actually ill and provides their medical, certification past the uncertified leave time, which most countries have, your initial 2-3 days, um, those provisions should be as best as possible met. So no one who is sick should be prejudiced by virtue of the fact that this has happened to them. That's one example. For example, if someone is on mandatory quarantine, so there are some areas that persons would have come in contact with an infected person, and they are by government order quarantined in their homes or in their communities, and they can't come out for a specific number of days. With the best will in the world, an employee can't come to work no matter how much they would want to, because they would not be allowed out of those spaces. Some employer may be able to pay some or part of their salary during that time. That should be encouraged. If they can't, they could consider a period of no paid leave or special leave or provisions of that nature, to see if they could ensure continuity of employment even whilst the employee, for example, is unable to be at work. In Trinidad, for example, I've been trying to get some more clarity on what the pandemic provision is likely to be. At last check, they need some order or provision. I understand that Minister Baptiste would have taken to cabinet to, put in place structures that employers could look to for guidance in terms of how to treat with persons who have no support, for example, to look after young children or ailing parents, because they have been asked to stay home, so they can't go out to work. So the steps I would do: assess what the law minimum standards is, make sure you don't go below. Look at your provisions, make sure as best as possible you can stay within those boundaries. Listen for new policies that may be rolled out, or guidance given by the government how to treat with some of these situations, and get creative. If you have a robust IT platform, try and migrate some of your people into, if they can, continuing to work at home, produce their accountabilities so that they can meet their contractual obligations and continue to get paid. So it's a multifaceted approach, but those would be the framework areas that I would look at, and then thereafter consider putting in place policies for something like this: a home working policy, a flexible work policy, an extended leave policy, as a go forward, having analyzed what is happening currently.
Thank you so much. And it's good that you touched on the business of pandemic leave, because Chantal had actually posted that in the chat, and so you already touched on that. So thank you so much. I see a comment here from Jean-Marc. He said, in Trinidad and Tobago, the government has recently announced at a press conference that persons who have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic will be given a grant of $1,500 TT a month for 3 months. So that's fantastic. Another example of the kind of social safety net provisions that are being put in place around the Caribbean. I have been asked, this is another question from Chantal, I've been asked to research the possibility of mandatory temperature testing upon entry to the workplace. Of course, no policy exists for that, and several issues have to be considered before it can be implemented. Example, privacy, union relations. What happens if an employer refuses to submit to testing? So that's a great question. I know Taiwan, well, different governments, of course, different contexts, but they actually manage the outbreak there by basically having mandatory testing in public buildings. Once upon entry, they have some, the device and what are we to test if people have a temperature. So, interesting question.
Indeed. And
Council, over to you.
there are lots of issues that arise from that. And whilst it is that we may not have had specific provisions in related to this matter, outside of government legislating for the public good, that your personal privacy can be, sort of suspended to have this done, and they could do it. Eh? Um, the principles that surround having these kind of invasive um, procedures, and I mean invasive relatively, because it's not that you're going to be sticking someone, for example, to get a blood sample, but the fact of having to subject oneself to what is effectively a medical related check is something that would have to be guided by contract. So, for example, we have some of our professions that the nature of them require that you have mandatory drug testing or even random drug testing from time to time. And those kinds of professions have standard clauses in your contract or your works rules or accepted by your union that this is something that is a requirement for the job, so that the employee is made aware of that and from the beginning subjects themselves to it. And that is how you would be allowed to take those kind of tests. Outside of those kind of contractual obligations, it would be difficult to force or to impose this test on an employee, albeit that you're trying to look out for their own good and for the good of others. If the government legislates that this is something that must be done, then that's a completely different matter. So that's how I would start my research. Is there any government provision that gives authority to do it? Legislation, for example, if there is none, is there a contractual provision in place that would give you the authority to do it? If there is none, then you're really going to be in the realm of seeking consensus with the employee, given what is happening, to subject themselves to it.
Here is another question. Do you have any recommendations for leaders as to how we can approach similar issues as a community? Or systems that we need to put in place to deal with the impact of a global crisis? Because Michelle from Trinidad points out, it's something that affects all employees, government, otherwise, and the fallout can be really phenomenal. So, what can we learn from this as an approach or a way we can approach global crises in the future?
Global crises is one thing, and that's what we're seeing now, but I don't even think we need to go as far as a global crisis. Many of you would have walked through many catastrophic events over time in your various countries. It could be a very bad hurricane. We saw Maria, Irma, Dorian just last year, and the impact that has. Everything feels normal life goes away, and you're now in the realm of trying to rebuild and, get your company, your country afloat again. So global, yes, with globalization, it's important because of the interconnectivity and how you could deal with that on the one hand. But I also venture to say that specific events in particular jurisdictions could elicit the same response. And the response I would undertake is this: examine what is the nature of your business. What are you in the business of doing? Are you providing a service? Are you producing a good that is, bought by others? The nature of your business will guide you as to how you can put in contingency measures to continue your business in particular circumstances whilst not exposing yourself or your employees to any risk. So a major aspect is to look at overhauling your contingency protocols. So yeah, some of us may say we have BCP, if a hurricane comes in, we tape up the windows, we bust it down, we put on the storm shutters, and we hope for the best. This goes beyond that. It asks us to examine what is the nature of your operations, how it can be done outside of being in a stationary place, if that is the case. If it is not, then you would have to how quickly you could mobilize after the nature of the catastrophic event is, and how it is that an employer should treat with employees in the circumstances. Do you have a set aside fund that could be helpful? These are all, some of it altruistic, and some businesses I readily accept just don't have the kind of margins to save up, quote unquote, for rainy days like this. But insofar as you are able to put structures in place to cushion for a set period of time, I would do that specifically for your business. Outside of that, use your capital to advocate in government structures, government-related legislators, in your stakeholder group, that matters of this nature should be contemplated as a national issue, so that when it occurs, the burden doesn't fall only on you as a business owner or operator, but there is shared provisions across the nation as to how matters of this nature will be addressed should they occur.
Thank you for that. We're almost at the end of our webinar. We're just going to take maybe just a couple more questions. So Marsha was asking, can we get more information regarding why in Jamaica an employer is unable to force, I think the employer is unable to force an employee to go on leave? Well, I know I can say that because I lived and breathed that case. And so there's the famous Laxton Robinson case,
yes,
where he took the government to court because one of the things that government did was to send him on leave, and the court ruled that it was unlawful to force an employee to go on leave, that the purpose of vacation leave is recreation, and therefore you could not force an employee to take their leave. So trust me, we have been there, we have done that, and there is the legal precedent set, so it really is unlawful. So that's, I got that right, Carla?
Yes, indeed, you did.
All right. There's another question that I saw in the chat, and thank you. There are lots of comments about, the kinds of things that are happening in the various countries around, things like social partnership and so on. There's a question from Kalisha, who says she's from Jamaica, and she says, persons who were to proceed on vacation leave prior to the pandemic, will the 2 weeks of closure of office supersede the vacation day request?
Let me be clear. Is it so the question that somebody has actually applied for leave before?
Before. And
yes.
So their approved vacation leave no coincides with the office closure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They're on vacation.
Leave still.
They're on vacation, and no employer outside of there being a genuine emergency should be asked to contact them to do any sort of work during the period. They're on vacation, and they should be paid accordingly.
I suppose what they're trying to figure out is that should they then be able to keep their vacation days,
no.
like could they convert to the being you're no longer on vacation because the office is closed.
No.
And so you get back those days. And you're saying
They're
no.
on vacation. The only way that would happen if the office is closed and nobody's getting paid, and they're on vacation, they should get paid. So I think that is going to be dependent on what the policy is and how the employer is going to review what would have happened specific to that person's peculiar situation. It's not something that can be as a in a modality like this give a particular response.
Great. So Carla, we're just about to wrap up. Part two thoughts.
Another point I wanted to raise as a provision that could be looked at, depending on how long this thing extends for. Most countries have provisions for layoff or short-time working, where the employee has the continuity of employment, even if the employer is unable to have them come in and work for us for a particular period of time, or if they can only work for a shorter amount of time. Most countries have provisions for that in their legislation, and should it come to that, employers should examine whether or not they want to invoke those provisions, look at the implications of it, and to, as far as is possible, keep the employee in their job, so having their continuity of service until they are able to revert to normal operation.
Okay, fantastic. Carla, it has been an absolute delight. This has been truly eye-opening, educational. Thank you so very much for not only your presentation, but for sharing so generously from your professional wisdom. And so we are just going to just end now with just a couple of announcements. So if you are here and you want to get some more information from Carla-Ann, that's her contact details there. Do register for our next webinars coming up shortly. And again, we're doing a lot of webinars about equipping all of us. How can we cope with COVID-19? And so we have talked a lot here about the advent of remote working. It's not new, but it is now happening like an avalanche. And so we're going to have with us one of our colleagues here at CARICAD, one of our partners, I would say. He has worked with us on other things, Mr. Ashish Uttamchandi. He's the CEO from Unified Networking Development Systems Limited, and he'll be sharing with us around how can we use ICT tools to facilitate remote working. And as usual, if you want to get technical assistance from us, if you want to find out more about our leadership development programs, which we are happy to say are virtual for the most part, do contact us for more information at our email address, caricad@caricad.net. As usual, we always end our webinars with an evaluation. We want to hear when you hold the webinar. We want to know if you have other topics or areas that you would want us to cover in future webinar topics. So the poll is already there to the right of your screen. So I invite you to take the few last minutes of this webinar just to fill out our poll. And once you have finished filling out our poll, you can just exit the session. And you can do that. Easiest way, go to the far top right-hand corner. You see an X. When you click on it, a dialog box will pop up inviting you to leave the session, and you can just say okay or yes. Thank you so much. Do look out for our other webinars. Do follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. Subscribe, go to our website and subscribe, and that way you get all our notifications all the time, our blogs, etc. We are definitely here at CARICAD working along with the region, supporting the COVID-19 response, and public sector transformation in general. Thank you so much for registering and for your questions and comments and for general participation. You will get a link to the recording of this webinar after this. So you can look out for that. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your workday and the rest of your week.